Imagine that you're in the cockpit of a commercial airliner, accelerating down the runway, when suddenly you realize that another aircraft is heading straight towards you in the opposite direction. Now, this is something that just shouldn't be possible, but yet, here we are. Stay tuned. The 22nd of January 2022 was a nice day in Hayden, Colorado, with only some small whisks of cloud at 500 feet, which were clearing up as the day progressed. The winds were also more or less calm, and because of that, it was turning out to be a good day for recreational flying in the area around Hayden, Yampa Valley Airport. Hayden town lies on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, close to several beautiful natural parks, and the closeness to that high peaks in the west means that the airport itself is also situated quite high up, at just over 6,600 feet. This in turn means that the minimum off-route altitude, more out to the east, reaches as high as 16,600 feet, and that's a detail that will soon become important. In any case, Yampa Valley is a relatively small airport and therefore has no dedicated control tower. Instead, it relies on pilots self-reporting their intentions on something known as a Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, or CTAF, where aircraft can also talk directly with each other if they would want to. And on that frequency, there may also be a so-called Unicom operator present who can give weather and traffic information, but that operator has no control function and, as far as I understand, no official procedures to follow either. Now, obviously, for commercial traffic to function properly, there needs to be some kind of interaction with the air traffic call system in order to get route clearances, etc. And in this case, that was done through the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC, on a separate frequency. So what this all meant was that aircrafts that were going to fly out of Hayden Yampa Valley Airport on an instrument flight plan would need to keep the CTAF frequency active on one radio and then the Denver ARTCC on the other. All clearances would come from Denver, but in order to keep track of what was going on in and around the airport itself, accurate communication on the common CTAF frequency was absolutely key. Now, if you think that this sounds a little bit messy, I would tend to agree. For an airport with mostly general aviation, I could see this working reasonably fine, but Yampa Valley wasn't just being used by smaller aircraft. In fact, the mix of operations during the 12th month prior to this day had included 2,100 commercial airliners, 3,955 air taxi flights, and 5,413 general aviation movements. That's 11,468 movements in total, averaging around 30 per day. Among all of these were some seasonal operations by the company JetBlue, and on the 22nd of January they had operated a morning service into Hayden from Fort Lauderdale in Florida. On board that flight were the two pilots who will take center stage in this story, but they hadn't actually been operating that particular flight. Instead, they were both based in Fort Lauderdale and had now been rostered to fly as passengers, something known as deadhead or passive duty, into Hayden, and they were then scheduled to operate as active pilots on the flight back towards Florida. The captain was 45 years old at the time and had worked for JetBlue for about 13 years. He was rated to fly several different types, including the ERJ 170, 190 and the Airbus A320, which was the aircraft that they were now about to operate. His total experience spanned just under 11,600 hours. Very similar to my experience actually, and there was no record of how much of that time that he had spent on the Airbus A320 family specifically. But we do know that he was well rested before the flight and that he had only operated around 44 hours during the preceding 30 days, which is quite civilized. The other pilot scheduled to fly on the return flight to Florida was a 40-year-old first officer. He had been working for JetBlue for about 8 years at the time and had amassed a total flying experience of 3,307 hours, with similar type ratings as the captain had. None of these two pilots had any records of previous accidents or incidents, and their training records were not quoted in the report, meaning that they were likely fine as well. Now, it's very likely that these two pilots used some of the time during their flight into Hayden to prepare for their coming outbound flight, and since the airport was a bit tricky, JetBlue had created a special airport brief for it. Airport briefs are normally issued for airports with unusual operational requirements or threats that the pilots need to be aware of, and in the case of Hayden Yampa Valley, this was because of very high minimum off-road altitude, MORAS, high terrain, high density altitude, and also, and this is super important here, frequent use of opposing runways, as well as high traffic density and no control tower. The briefing also included instructions around how the pilots needed to make traffic calls and monitor the frequency carefully, and that they needed to call up the airport operations on the Unicom frequency 10 minutes prior to departure. It also highlighted that runway 10 was primarily used for arrivals with tailwinds up to 10 knots, so the pilots in this story were likely well aware of all of these things as they started preparing for the return flight. The flight plan and no times back towards Fort Lauderdale were straightforward, and the weather was, like I mentioned before, also not really a factor here. It was cold and it had snowed during the night, but as the day was progressing, the weather was clearing up more and more, leaving only some few fleeting clouds at around 500 feet. So, after their arrival into Hayden, the two pilots soon entered the cockpit and started preparing it for the return flight. They had decided that the captain would operate as pilot flying on this leg, so while he started to set up the cockpit for departure, the first officer went out and completed the walk-around. The aircraft that they were going to operate was a beautiful 12 years old Airbus A320 with no known technical defects recorded in its logbook. And as the pilots continued setting it up, it was also fueled according to the flight plan, which meant that together with the weight of the 102 passengers and 6 crew members, the calculated takeoff weight came to 145,782 pounds, which was 1,800 pounds below the maximum takeoff weight for runway 10. With that weight, the takeoff speeds, V1, the decision speed, VR, rotation speed, and V2, the safe engine out climb speed, came to 142, 142, and 143 knots, and that's worth remembering. Now, at the same time as the JetBlue crew were preparing their Airbus for departure, another aircraft was on its way in towards Hayden Yampa Valley Airport. This was a 28-year-old Beechcraft B300 King Air with the tail number N350 Juliet, flown by a male pilot and his wife, and we don't know much more about his age and experience, but it won't really matter much for what's about to happen anyway. He was flying on an instrument flight plan, and as this story really begins to take shape, he had just started his descent and was coming in towards Hayden from the east, with intention to do an ILS approach for runway 10, the same runway that the JetBlue crew were planning to use for their departure. At around time 11:45 Mountain Standard Time, the boarding of JetBlue Flight 1748 had been fully completed, and the cabin crew were closing the doors and preparing for departure with 108 passengers and crew on board. The two pilots were also done with their cockpit preparation and therefore now proceeded with the before engine start checklist. As soon as the doors were closed at time 11:48, the first officer called up the common CTAF frequency and announced that JetBlue Flight 1748 were about to start pushing back, and also that they shortly intended to start taxiing out towards runway 10 for departure. Now, there was no reply to this call, but only 5 seconds later, the Beech King Air called up on the same frequency and said,
Hayden, Yampa Valley, King Air 350 Juliet. We're about 9 minutes out for a 10 coming in from the east, descending out of 17,000, 350 Juliet.
To this call, the Unicom operator responded and explained that there were multiple inbound aircraft, that the winds were calm and that the altimeter setting was 30.36, and the King Air read this back. In the cockpit of the JetBlue Airbus, the two pilots now discussed that last call, especially the fact that there were multiple inbound aircraft for runway 10. And then the first officer called up Denver Center and advised them that they were still on the ground at Hayden, that they were about to start their engines and would be ready for departure in about 6 to 7 minutes. Denver Center replied and asked if they intended to use runway 10, and when the first officer replied and said that they were, the Denver controller told them to call back when they were at the runway holding point as number 1 for departure and ready to go. That's when they would receive their en route clearance. This was acknowledged by the first officer, and 30 seconds later, the aircraft began its pushback and started up its first engine. As that was happening, the King Air also called up Denver Center, but initially got no response. And at the same time, the pilots in the Airbus had just begun starting up their second engine. When the King Air called up Denver Center a second time, he finally got a response, and the pilot in the King Air asked if it would be possible for him to cancel his instrument flight plan and proceed visually towards runway 28 instead, since he could now see that runway clearly. The Denver controller responded that it was up to the pilot if he wanted to cancel his instrument flight plan, so the King Air pilot confirmed that he would do so and then proceeded under visual rules towards runway 28 instead. The controller acknowledged this and told him that he was free to change frequency. Now, I am being very detailed with this exchange because it constitutes an absolutely crucial detail in this story, which I will get to soon. But what I need you to understand here is that whenever I cover incidents like this, I want to make sure that I really understand it from every available angle. And often, using today's sponsor, Ground News, is one part in how I do that. Ground News is my go-to app for comparing news coverage across different sources, and as a long-term sponsor, they form a critical part in making these videos possible. And you can follow along using this QR code or going to ground.news/mp. Actually, let me show you what I mean. When I searched for this JetBlue incident, I found various different articles from sources worldwide, and what's fascinating is just how differently they framed that same event. For example, the left-leaning Business Insider emphasized how the JetBlue pilots' quick decision-making were crucial, painting them out as heroes. While the right-leaning Post-Millennials instead focused on how many close calls there had been in that month. So Ground News helps me to keep my videos unbiased and therefore helps me to avoid spreading misinformation. Each article includes a factuality score, showing how reliable the source is based on ratings from 3 independent monitors. And in fact, you can now also follow aviation news in a special Mentour News custom feed. Once you start reading the news like this, it's impossible to go back, and you, my viewers, can get started with a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which is the same plan that I use. Just scan this QR code or go to ground.news/mp and sign up. I'll leave a link to it here below as well. Thank you, Ground News, for supporting my team and I, and now let's get back to why those radio calls were so important. So like I mentioned before, the exchange between Denver Center and the King Air, where the pilot advised that he would cancel his IFR flight plan and instead proceed visually towards the opposite runway, runway 28, took place at the same time as the 2 Airbus pilots were in the middle of starting up their second engine and perform the after-start checklist. This meant that they, even though they would have maybe heard some radio traffic going on, were likely focused on their own duties and therefore didn't pick up the details of that exchange. Remember, the Denver Center frequency was very busy at the time, with several other calls going on as well, so the likelihood of these pilots giving a call from a random King Air any special attention was very low. But the call that happened next should have been easier to pick up. Because at time 11:53 and 7 seconds, the King Air now called up the Hayden Common CTAF frequency with the following message.
350 Juliet's going to go ahead and land 28, Hayden Yampa Valley. We're straight in 28 right now.
Now this frequency was significantly less busy than the Denver control, so this call should have been heard by the JetBlue pilots. But they were at this point getting ready to taxi, and that includes looking around, making sure that all ground equipment is clear and preparing to navigate on the ground. So it is possible that they were still slightly preoccupied and therefore didn't catch this call either. Another detail that I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the King Air pilot never used the prefix runway in any of his calls. Instead, it was only referred to as 10 or 28, and even though that might sound obvious to everyone sitting at home, correct and detailed phraseology is actually very important, and certain words contain triggers for us pilots. Now, I am aware that I have only operated a very limited amount in US airspace and that the phraseology there tends to differ in intensity quite a bit. But I have noticed in several final reports that radio calls in the US tends to have a more relaxed nature, and that words like runway or sometimes even complete readbacks are sometimes missing. In this case, the clear use of runway 28 might have actually triggered some attention from the JetBlue pilots, something that the phrase "we're straight in 28 now" just didn't do. In any case, 10 seconds after the King Air had called us in on the CTAF frequency, the first officer of Flight 1748 also called in and advised that they were coming off the ramp for runway 10. That meant that they were now about to leave the apron and enter the taxiway heading towards the holding point for runway 10. The Unicom operator responded and just advised them that there were multiple aircraft inbound without specifying to which runway. And he then gave them the wind as calm and altimeter setting 30.36, which the first officer also acknowledged. The JetBlue pilots then proceeded with reading through the after-start checklist, and at the very same time the King Air called up and reported that
350 Juliet, 12-mile final 28 straight in Hayden Yampa Valley.
Still without using that prefix runway. So again, this call happened as the two JetBlue pilots were busy doing something else, and only a few seconds later the first officer told the captain that they were number 1 for departure and asked him if he wanted to do something else first. This was likely to see if he should call up Denver Center and report that they were almost ready, but the captain responded that they should probably wait for those inbound planes to come in first. This shows good airmanship on behalf of these two pilots, who at this point were both expecting that all inbound traffic were coming in towards runway 10, the same runway they were planning to use for takeoff, so waiting for them would make perfect sense. Now, expectation bias is a very powerful psychological phenomenon where a person's expectation of what's going on or what's going to happen will heavily influence what they hear and how they will interpret any information. In this case, both of the JetBlue pilots had at a very early stage formed a mental picture of the traffic flow into the airport, which included multiple inbounds to runway 10. And since there was no controller at the airport, they had then missed the calls from the King Air, which indicated that he had now chosen the opposite runway for landing. Hopefully that explains what happened next, because without this psychological explanation, it doesn't make almost any sense at all. Because now, the two aircraft started talking directly to each other, with the King Air pilot asking on the frequency,
"Anyone about to depart 10 at Hayden?"
and the captain in the Airbus answering,
JetBlue 1748 is going to hold short of runway 10 at the end of the runway, waiting for our clearance.
The King Air pilot then continued,
"All right, we are on a 10 miles final 28 straight in."
and to that, the captain finally responded,
"All right, copy that. We'll keep an eye out for you."
which the King Air pilot then acknowledged. Now, that's pretty clear, don't you think? Well, keep in mind here that whilst the King Air pilot had clearly said 28, he still wasn't using the prefix runway. And because the two JetBlue pilots were so convinced that he was on final for runway 10, this information just didn't seem to register. Instead, the pilots in the Airbus commented, "All right, so he's coming in now," both expecting to see him turn up on the right-hand side soon. They then started going through the before takeoff checklist, where they verbalized the V speeds of 142, 142 and 143, checking that those speeds were properly set in the FMC, on their screens and also in the mode control panel. Once that was done, the first officer took back the radio and called up Denver Control, like he had promised to do, in order to copy the en route clearance. And now, the next piece of this puzzle falls into place. The first officer said,
"Denver, JetBlue 1748, number 1 at runway 10, ready for departure."
The Denver controller responded and asked him to confirm that they were fully ready, which the first officer also did, and the controller then said,
JetBlue 1748 cleared from Hayden to Fort Lauderdale as filed, climb and maintain 13,000, squawk 0622, release, clearance void if not off in 2 minutes.
Now, whilst the first part of that clearance was a standard en route clearance with routing, altitude and transponder code, the last part was something very specific for an uncontrolled airport. You see, since there was no controller on the airport that could give an actual takeoff clearance, it was up to the pilots to verify the runway to be clear before departure and then to just take off. But in order to be able to verify that this actually happened and to keep some kind of track of it if something had gone wrong, the Denver Controller Center also gave a 2-minute window for the aircraft to take off, something also known as void time. If the aircraft had not taken off by then, well, then they would need to call up to get a new clearance, and if they didn't, the Denver Center could start to investigate why. Pretty clever, but in this case it also came with a pretty significant secondary effect. You see, as the first officer read back this clearance, a new sense of urgency got hold of the two JetBlue pilots. And even though it wouldn't have been a disaster to miss that 2-minute window, they still wanted to avoid that. So they quickly now finished their review of the departure route to follow, and then they completed the before takeoff checklist. Both of them then looked out through the right to see if they could see the traffic that they were expecting on final for runway 10, but they couldn't see anything there, neither out through the window or through the TCAS on their navigation display. So they figured that the inbound traffic must be very slow moving and that they therefore would have plenty of time to take off before it became a problem. Now at this point I should probably explain a few things here. First of all, in the case where there is no air traffic control available, landing traffic always has the right of way in front of traffic that is still on the ground. The Airbus pilots knew this and therefore wanted to get away as soon as possible so they wouldn't be in the way of the landing traffic. Secondly, the TCAS, Traffic Collision and Avoidance System, has quite a few restrictions built into it when the aircraft is still on the ground or at a very low altitude. For example, all oral advisory messages and warnings are inhibited on the ground, all traffic advisory messages inhibited up to 600 feet, and resolution advisories are inhibited up to 1100 feet. This is to make sure that the pilots aren't fooled into making abrupt maneuvers close to the ground, but TCAS would still show the traffic symbols of any aircraft in its vicinity on the navigational display. So if the pilots would have increased their scale and looked on the other side of the runway, they would have likely spotted the approaching King Air, who was now getting ready to land. But instead, in this case, the two Airbus pilots just continued with their departure procedures, which included sitting the cabin crew down for departure, and when that was done and the aircraft was entering the runway, the first officer sent the following message out over the CTAF frequency.
Hayden traffic, JetBlue 1748 released and we're taking off runway 10.
Now, I'm sure you can imagine the kind of shock and confusion that this must have led to in the cockpit of the King Air. This pilot likely thought that he had been more than clear of where he was and what he was doing, since he had made at least 3 different position reports, including direct communication with the two JetBlue pilots. Within 5 seconds, the King Air pilot therefore responded on the CTAF frequency and said,
Hayden, Yampa Valley, you got a King Air on final 28. Hayden, Yampa Valley, we have been calling.
Now you would think that that call would finally be enough to solve this confusion and get the two JetBlue pilots back in the game, but you would sadly be wrong. Instead, in the JetBlue cockpit, the two pilots now discussed the position of the calling aircraft, but their expectation bias was so strong that it just did not register that he was actually straight ahead of them. Instead, the first officer called up the CTAF frequency again and said,
"Yeah, I thought you guys were still like 8-9 miles out."
Which prompted the King Air pilot to answer,
4 miles.
And then his wife chipping in,
"Less than that."
Now obviously, if the two JetBlue pilots had understood that they were talking to an aircraft that was landing straight towards them on the other side of the runway, they would have just held their position or even taxied off again. But that didn't happen. Instead, the captain just told his colleague, "Well, we're taking off now," which prompted the first officer to again radio the CTAF and say,
"And JetBlue is on the roll, JetBlue 1748 on the roll, runway 10 Hayden."
And to that, the King Air pilot just chillingly answered,
"All right, we're on short final. I hope you don't hit us."
Now, if there ever was a call that should have gotten the JetBlue pilot's attention, it was this one. And that's because, in their mind, they were now speeding up their departure to avoid getting in the way of the aircraft they thought was behind them. But an aircraft behind them wouldn't say, "I hope you don't hit us." If anything, they would say, "I hope I don't hit you." And another question that we have to ask here is why the King Air, who clearly did understand what was about to happen, didn't just discontinue his approach. Well, if you think about it, that could actually cause an even bigger issue seen from his perspective. A jetliner who's taking off will likely do so around halfway down the runway and then climb very fast. And the King Air, who was on path to touch down on the touchdown zone on the other side, would therefore, at least theoretically, be out of the way of the departing airliner, providing everything went as it should. But if he would choose to go around and start climbing, he would be at a higher altitude further down the runway and could then possibly be even more likely to have a head-on collision with the Airbus. On the other hand, he could have just broken off and proceeded visually for a downwind for runway 10, but this is not something that a pilot should ever have to consider. And I can't even imagine what must have been going through his mind when he heard that JetBlue was now taking off straight towards him. In the Airbus, everything initially proceeded normally, with the captain spooling up the engines and then pushing the thrust lever forward into the full toga detent, and they were using full thrust here likely because of the high pressure altitude of the airport. So the two jet engines now roared into life and with full effect started slowly accelerating the aircraft down the runway. The first officer soon called out "airspeed alive" as the speed tape started moving on his primary flight display, and then only 7 seconds later he said, "He's on 28?" To which the captain responded, "Is he? Oh shit," followed by the first officer making the standard 80 knots, power set call. So what had happened here was that the first officer had done a standard scan of his instrument and had therefore noticed a TCAS target straight ahead in their takeoff direction. This happened before 80 knots was called, so the correct thing for the captain to do would have been to execute a low-speed rejected takeoff and then just taxi off. But that didn't happen. Instead, both pilots now started looking out through their windows to try and identify the aircraft visually, but because they were now trying to see a majority white aircraft towards a background of white snowy mountains and a thin cloud layer, they could see nothing. Meanwhile, their Airbus was accelerating with each passing second, making the decision to reject harder and harder. The JetBlue pilots continued to discuss whether any of them could actually see the traffic, but none of them could. And as that discussion was going on, the King Air pilot again came onto the frequency and asked,
You guys do a quicker turnout in case we're..."
and was then stepped on by another transmission, likely from the JetBlue first officer, who was responding,
"Yes, sir."
Now we don't know for sure, but maybe that last transmission gave the JetBlue captain what he needed in order to make a decision about what course of action to take. Like I mentioned before, a rejected takeoff would have been the most sensible thing to do, and it could have been taken all the way up to V1, as this was clearly a situation of the aircraft being unsafe to fly. But faced with a situation he had likely never seen before, and the associated startle and stress that came with that, it's possible that the captain was now temporarily overwhelmed, and that therefore the mention of an early turn took over in his head. In any case, when that transmission happened, he just responded, "Oh, Jesus Christ," and then he started pulling back on his side stick. Now this happened just as the aircraft passed 118 knots, meaning a full 24 knots before it had reached its calculated rotation speed. And because of that, the first officer now shouted out, "You're slow! Airspeed, 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 airspeed!" But the nose of the aircraft had at this point already started rotating and was now moving into a higher and higher angle. Now the way that the rotation speed is calculated is by using performance data from the aircraft combined with weight, temperature, pressure and a few other things to determine when the aircraft will be able to safely take off and then continue to fly with required margins. If the aircraft is rotated before that speed, there will not be enough air flowing over the wings to effectively carry the aircraft into the air. And that means that unless the rotation is discontinued, the aircraft will just increase the nose angle until eventually its tail will scrape the ground, which will happen at an angle of about 11.7 degrees or so if the main gear is compressed. And that's exactly what now happened. As the aircraft passed between taxiways Alpha 5 and Alpha 4, meaning well before the runway midpoint, a security camera on the ramp recorded the aircraft's struggle to get airborne and its eventual tail strike. In the cockpit, the pilots could feel a strong bump as the tail touched the ground, and it was much more pronounced and violent than they thought that a tail strike would feel like. The aircraft then slowly got airborne, and the captain lowered the nose to allow the speed to start building up. The first officer called out, "Positive rate," and then took the gear up, whilst the captain called out, "What the was that?" And to that, his colleague just responded, "I think it may have been the tail." But now they had other things to think about, because the King Air was just 2.3 nautical miles in front of them, approaching fast. And like I explained before, TCAS would not give them any resolution advisories this close to the ground. So the captain quickly started turning right to avoid the oncoming traffic, whilst the King Air pilot made an unintelligible call on the frequency. The JetBlue first officer responded by saying,
"JetBlue's making the turn."
To which the King Air finally responded,
"Yep, thank you."
He was now on very short final, and since he could see the Airbus turning away in front of him, he decided to just continue and land. After the aircraft was safely down, the King Air pilot taxied into the apron and then called up Denver Control to ask about the best way to report this incident. He must have been quite upset by the whole ordeal. But this story is still far from over. In the JetBlue cockpit, the pilots now continue their normal procedures by retracting the flaps and completing the after-takeoff checklist. At the same time, they were obviously discussing what they had just experienced, and both of them agreed that they had been sure that the other aircraft had been on final for runway 10. The first officer also pointed out that the captain had rotated way too early, to which the captain agreed, and he now said that he would write in the tail strike into the aircraft's logbook once they had landed back in Fort Lauderdale. As this discussion was going on, Denver Control called them up, first without getting an answer, but when he tried again, asking about their flight altitude, the first officer answered,
"JetBlue 1748, we're 10,100, climbing to 13,000 off Hayden,"
without mentioning a word about what had just happened. The controller responded that he had radar contact with them and that they needed to maintain 13,000 feet because of some traffic, a Hawker maintaining 14,000 feet straight ahead of them. Now, this gave the pilots some further time to discuss what they had just been through, and that included again pointing out how sure they had been about the King Air being on runway 10, but also how they felt that the Unicom operator should have told them that the traffic was actually coming in on runway 28. Obviously that would have been great, but the Unicom operator had no such obligations, and even though he could have done so, the fact that these two pilots were clearly talking to each other and that the King Air had repeatedly pointed out that he was coming in on 28 would have likely been seen as more than enough by that operator. The pilots then also discussed how they thought that the King Air was on an instrument IFR flight plan and how he therefore should have been taken in on runway 10 by the Denver controller. But those points were all moot. These type of discussions are all very typical after a traumatic event where the involved parties tries to find a way to explain and rationalize their own actions. That's all very human, but what that discussion failed to realize was that they now had another very real problem. You see, there is no way for a pilot in the cockpit to assess how badly damaged their aircraft is after a tail strike like this. Yes, the damage could cause issues with the pressurization, which could then lead to warnings, but even if that's not the case, there might still be substantial structural damage that doesn't give any warnings at all. Now here comes today's lesson from the cockpit. Whenever we are faced with a situation where there are many possible outcomes and we have some time available to evaluate it, we pilots are trained to use specific decision-making models to deal with it. Now, this is something that I often talk about in my leadership courses, and these models come with different names in different airlines, like FORDEC, for example, but they all say basically the same thing. I use a model called PIOSI, and the way that this model is supposed to be used is by calmly going through the following points. P stands for problem. What is the problem that we are facing? Now, the mistake that most people make on this point is that they misidentify the problem as something that has already happened, rather than what lies ahead of them. A great example of this is where the pilots might think that the tail strike is the problem, when the real problem is actually the issues that this tail strike could pose going forward. If this model would have been used correctly here, the problem would have been possible structural damage to the aircraft, which could lead to further structural issues, pressurization problems, and any number of further failures. Now, when PIOSI is being used, it's always a good idea for the most senior member of the team to ask the question, what do you see as the problem? And then let the most junior team member answer that question. This is because it's possible that this junior crew member could come up with things that the senior hadn't thought about, and he or she will be more likely to state those opinions if asked first, rather than after the more senior members have spoken. So in this case, if the captain would have asked his first officer, he might have responded exactly this: tail strike with possible structural issues, and that would have then brought them to the next step in PIOSI, which is the I for information. This step includes gathering information, which could be done from other crew members, ATC or weather sources, for example, but crucially, it could also come from manuals and emergency checklists. And as it turns out, even though no ECAM warnings or action items were present in this case, there still existed an Airbus QRH checklist for tail strike. That checklist stated 1. Land as soon as possible. 2. Max flight level is 100 or MSA. Rate of climb should be targeted to 500 feet per minute, descend to 1000 feet per minute, and approach with normal rate. 3. Notify air traffic control of rate of climb. 4. Ram air on. And 5. Pack 1 and 2 off. Now, this is quite straightforward, and it really shows the crew that this is a serious issue. Hence, land as soon as possible. The rest of the checklist basically tells the crew not to pressurize the aircraft, as the pressure vessel is basically like a balloon, and if that balloon has been weakened by the tail strike, it could pop and then cause even worse damage. With an unpressurized cabin, the climb and descent rate will directly affect the passengers, so higher rates will quickly become very uncomfortable, and that's why the checklists referred to those rates. Anyway, if the information gathering is done correctly, well then the next part of PIOSI becomes much easier. O stands for options. In this case, the QRH checklist said that they needed to land as soon as possible, so options here would have been more about choosing a suitable diversion airport. S stands for select, which means actually selecting one of the options. The first E stands for execute that option, and the second E stands for evaluate. Now, doing a proper evaluation is super important as you go along, since new problems might arise, forcing you to change your plans. So basically, that last E brings you back to the beginning of PIOSI again, like a round clock face. So this is how these decision-making models are supposed to be used, but the pilots in this JetBlue cockpit didn't seem to follow any of these structured models, even though they did still do some of the steps. They started by completing the after takeoff checklist, which would have included verifying the aircraft's pressurization. And when they saw that this was working normally, they seemed to have assumed that the tail strike was no big deal. That in turn then meant that when the Denver controller came back and cleared them to climb to flight level 230, they happily accepted that and started climbing, allowing the pressurization system to slowly increase the differential pressure, pressurizing the balloon. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, the minimum off-route altitude, MORA in this case, was very high, 16,600 feet where they were flying, so they would have had to climb to that altitude anyway, unless they would get radar vectors lower. But they should not have accepted any higher altitude clearances than that. But that was something that they would only have known if they would have used the Quick Reference Handbook, the QRH, which they didn't do. But the captain did call up the cabin crew to see what they had noticed, and the attendant who answered that call said that they had indeed felt that the tail had hit the runway. She also explained that the impact had been very hard, enough to cause people's belongings to fall from their knees onto the floor, and that several passengers were therefore very worried. Now, hearing that, combined with the hard bump that they had felt themselves, should have definitely led the pilots towards that tail strike checklist, and the fact that it still didn't, in my view, just points towards a lack of training. But it is also obvious that the captain started to get a bit worried here, enough to make him want to contact the company maintenance rep over their company frequency. But not before accepting to climb even higher, up to flight level 260. When the captain started talking to the JetBlue maintenance representative, he explained what had happened and how violent the cabin crew had experienced the event, but he also mentioned that they didn't have any pressurization issues at the moment. The engineer told him to stay on the frequency while he checked if the aircraft had downlogged any of the fault messages that were available, and whilst he was doing that, the first officer checked in with a new Denver controller who cleared them to climb to flight level 310, and then 2 minutes later to flight level 350. Meanwhile, the maintenance engineer got back to the captain and recommended that they should not continue to Fort Lauderdale. The captain agreed, and together they decided that the best thing to do was to divert to Denver instead, since it was relatively close. So at time 12:12 and 13 seconds, the first officer asked Denver Control to initially level off at flight level 310. This was approved, and the captain then called up the cabin crew and informed them about the coming diversion. And he then followed that up with a PA to the passengers, explaining the incident and their need for a tech diversion. Everything was handled really well from this point onwards. The crew then informed the controller that they needed to divert to Denver due to a technical issue, and when asked if they had an emergency, they responded that they didn't, which was perfectly correct in this case since there was no indicated imminent danger. However, if they would have done the QRH checklist at this point, they would have encountered a bit of a conundrum. You see, the tail strike QRH checklist is not created to be used in an aircraft that is already in cruise at a high altitude. It instead assumes that a tail strike is sensed immediately and that the checklist is therefore executed before the aircraft climbs above the maximum altitudes of 10,000 feet or MSA, whichever is higher. So what to do in this case then? Well, these pilots never actually took up the checklist, so it wasn't really an issue for them. But what if they had? Now, this is an open question to you, but it actually has led to some confusion and issues in the past where pilots have followed the checklist to the letter and therefore ended up depressurizing the aircraft at altitude with an emergency descent as a result. This is actually something that I think that both Airbus and Boeing should improve in their tail strike checklist, since it is far from clear. But my guess is that the most rational thing, if the aircraft is already pressurized and at high altitude, would be to perform a gentle pressurized descent down to below 10,000 feet. The differential pressure, meaning the difference in pressure between the inside and outside of the cabin, would then also gently decrease. And once the aircraft is below 10,000 feet, you could maybe consider depressurizing it then, gently of course, and follow the checklist from that point. But I am not sure what the best procedure from a structural point of view is, so if you're an aircraft structural engineer out there, feel free to let me know what you think in the comment section here below, and while you're down there, remember to subscribe and like the channel. In any case, Flight 1748 soon started descending down towards Denver, and they now also had to explain to the controller what kind of maintenance issue that they had. During the descent, both pilots continued to discuss how this mistake had been possible in the first hand, and in that discussion they actually did mention expectation bias as the most likely culprit. And they also discussed that they could have rejected, which I think was a quite nice touch. You see, we pilots do make mistakes, and the absolutely most important thing, after having solved those mistakes of course, is that we try and learn from them. But in order to do that, we need to be able to first self-critique, because without that, there can be no learning, and that's something that I want you out there to take away from all of this. If something you didn't want to happen happened, ask yourself honestly if you could have acted differently and don't try to just deflect the blame. That will likely lead to the most effective learning experience for you, and that's what I'm hoping for. Anyway, the crew of JetBlue Flight 1748 were eventually told to expect a visual approach into Denver, which they then briefed for. And at time 12:42 and 14 seconds, about 45 minutes after the tail strike had occurred, the aircraft touched down safely on runway 35 right and then taxied into the apron. The passengers were disembarked and eventually provided with an alternate flight down to Florida, but the aircraft was grounded with substantial damage to its tail section, as you can see here. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that contributing to the cause of this serious incident was the JetBlue pilot's expectation that the King Air was approaching runway 10, when in reality that was clearly not the case. The King Air pilot's non-standard phraseology, specifically the fact that he didn't say runway in any of his calls, was seen as one of the reasons why the pilots didn't snap out of their faulty mental model. And the captain's early rotation when surprised by the oncoming traffic then directly led to the tail strike. JetBlue has, since this incident, been working with their instructors to give better guidance on how to safely operate from untowered airports, how to deal with unannunciated failures like tail strikes, and just general QRH procedures. Now, I have no information about what happened to the two pilots, but I hope that they just received some extra training and were then allowed back to the line again, because that's how just culture should work. People should not be punished for honest mistakes, especially after having accurately reported them. Now, if you want to see my next video before anyone else, hopefully even today, then please use your phone camera and scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. I am planning to hold another Patreon hangout very soon, and I would love to hear what you thought of that video on that call. Also, remember to take full advantage of your special deal from my sponsor. It really helps the channel. And remember that I only take sponsors who I am sure will give you good value. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.